my name is Margarett Waterbury. I am a writer and editor. I live in Portland, Oregon. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Blue Lake green bean in Oregon. To do that, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some photos while I talk. These are Blue Lake green beans. This photo was taken by Sean Linehan. This was taken in Corvallis in the summer of 2022 at an Oregon State University test plot. Blue Lake beans are the most widely grown variety of bean in Oregon. They are a member of the species Phaseolus vulgaris, which means the common bean. And this bean is originally native to Central America. It was introduced to Europe during the Columbian Exchange. And the beans that those Central Americans were eating hundreds of years ago looked pretty different than the beans we eat today. So over the centuries, there's been a lot of kind of structured and unstructured breeding work to develop a bean that has this crunchy, tender, succulent pod, rather than growing really big bean seeds to dry and cook later. So, and more recently, kind of over the last 100 years, it's also lost the stringiness of early string beans. So that kind of fibrous strip that you have to peel off along the seam. So it's become kind of a true snap bean. That's sort of what that language means. So green beans have been a really important crop for Oregon for about 100 years, and plant breeding has played a kind of a key role in making that happen. This is an image from the UC Davis Library Archives and Special Collections. It's a label that was on, you can see, you're like, this is a presentation about Oregon green beans. Why are we talking about California? But this is a label that was on some canned green beans from California, from the Blue Lakes region, just around Ukiah. So Blue Lakes came to Oregon kind of via California. There was a small canning industry around Ukiah that kind of emerged in the late 1800s, right after the transcontinental railroads were built. And so this was a time when kind of small agricultural regions all of a sudden had the ability to tap into these bigger markets outside of their sort of region. And so in Ukiah, they were canning this bean that they called the white creaseback. It was a pole bean, and it was famous for being kind of tender and tasty. So the owner, around the same time, right, canneries were also starting in Oregon. And the owner of an Oregon-based cannery visited Ukiah in the 1930s. He tasted and liked these beans, and he brought home some sample seeds. It grew well in Oregon. He decided that he liked it. And they began kind of asking some of their growers to grow this what they started calling a Blue Lake bean. And it quickly became the primary bean grown in Oregon. There were a few reasons. It was really easy to process. It was long, it was straight, it was round, which meant that it could be mechanically sorted efficiently. And it also held up its kind of texture and flavor when it was canned, right? This was the middle of the 20th century. Canned and frozen vegetables were really prominent. Things were often served like on a hotel hot plate, right? So a crop that could kind of retain some texture in those sort of conditions was really desirable. And they also grew really well in the Willamette Valley. So quickly they became this really important crop for Oregon farmers and for Oregon food processors. So this photo and the rest of the kind of historic images that we're going to look at are from a book called A Story of the Blue Lake Pole Bean in Western Oregon by James R. Baggett and William Lucas. James Baggett was a professor of horticulture and a plant breeder at Oregon State University. And William Lucas was the production manager of AgriPack Unlimited, which was a major Oregon processor. And in this photo, Farmer Smith, and that's actually his name, his first name is Farmer, was the manager and president of Staten Canning Company from 1944 to 1974. And here he is with a bank executive at some sort of like trade event or promotion event, promoting green beans as a sort of engine of economic opportunity for Oregon. This is a picture of some Blue Lakes, Blue Lake pole beans growing in near Eugene. This is Juanita Chase was the daughter of a farming family in Eugene. They grew beans for Eugene fruit growers, and they were early advocates of irrigation, which really increased yield. And you can see in this picture, like, just how many beans are on these plants. Blue Lake pole beans were extremely labor intensive to grow. And they were labor intensive at multiple stages. So this is a photo of people stringing a bean yard. So because these were pole beans, they needed to grow on trellises for support. They got quite tall. And so the trellises were actually built fresh every year. So they would, set these poles in the field and then run wire in between the poles and then run string up and over the wires. So this was, the hand labor kind of started even before the beans, the seeds were actually in the ground. And then, of course, the beans were picked by hand. This is a bean picker. They didn't all ripen at once, so each row had to be picked multiple times. They were picked into these burlap sacks that were then kind of brought to the end of the row, and folks were paid by weight. So it was a common job, for like a summer job for local teens and college students. But there were also a lot of migrant laborers who came to Oregon to pick beans in the summer. I talked with somebody who picked beans as a teenager, and he remembered in 1960 that he was paid about 2.5 cents a pound. And that a good picker could pick many hundreds of pounds in a day, so up to 1,000 pounds. And then the beans were processed. And this also took place with a lot of hand labor, not entirely by hand. You can see there's conveyor belts and machines and stuff, but because all of these beans were processed, so canned or frozen, there was, a lot of opportunity for workers in processing plants as well. I think that these workers are processing beans for canning because they're all being oriented a particular way. At the height of sort of the Oregon pole bean industry in the 50s and early 60s, more than 50,000 people were employed at the height of the season. And because there was a lot of migrant labor, so people would be coming from as far away as like Oklahoma, or Arkansas, California, Washington State. They would often stay in camps, either on the farms or near the farms that were operated by the Farm Security Administration. And there was kind of a social aspect to this too. People would often return year after year to the same farm to work. And so they would, see the same people. They would bring their kids and families. There's some fun history about like what they would do in the evenings. Often some of the people I talked with who picked beans as teenagers said that they would wind up the day by like 3 when it got hot. So there was some time in the afternoon and the evening for people to recreate. And so sometimes, at these camps, they would have barbecues or talent shows or dances or stuff to do before they had to go pick beans the next morning. And so in the 1950s, though, things started to change. So it was kind of becoming increasingly clear that Oregon growers were going to need to move to mechanical harvesting to compete effectively with other states that grew a lot of green beans. And the Blue Lake pole bean just was not suitable for mechanical harvesting. So Oregon State University started working on breeding a bush Blue Lake bean. This is a photo of one of these trial plots from 1959. Bush beans, like the yields were much lower than pole beans. Like it could be about half of a pole bean yard in terms of actual like productivity of, per ton beans. But the labor costs involved were so much lower, right? Not only could they be mechanically harvested, but they also can, you don't need to build those trellises every year. So it made sense for growers. And it also made it possible for them to transition from these like really intensive, small scale labor intensive farms to larger, less labor intensive, extensive farming. That transition started to happen in the late 60s and into the 1970s. There were mixed feelings. Some growers felt that the bush beans weren't as tasty as the pole beans, but sort of the economic pressures from other states were just kind of too intense for Oregonians to do nothing. This is a table from the Oregon Agricultural Statistics and Directory from 2021. Today, Oregon still grows quite a lot of beans. We grow somewhere between 10 and 12,000 acres of snap beans annually. Still, these are almost all for processing. And this is a table from the USDA 2021 vegetable summary. And there's a lot of numbers here, but the sort of key takeaway is that Oregon doesn't plant as many acres of beans as many other states. I think it's like 6th in terms of acreage. But it is the most productive state by acre in the nation. So an acre of beans in Oregon produces almost 3 times as many beans as an acre in Florida. And that breeding work is still going on. So this is Jim Myers. He's a professor of vegetable breeding at Oregon State University. And he's still working on improving the Blue Lake beans. So he led the development of a cultivar called Blue Lake OSU 5630, which is now, the predominant bean grown in Oregon. But he's still kind of working on improving, he and his team are working on improving it even further. So breeding for disease resistance and other factors that farmers want. So with the goal, right, of Oregon growers being able to grow green beans for another 100 years successfully. And when you go to the grocery store and buy frozen green beans, we don't think of them. They're not as beautiful or sexy as going to the farmer's market and buying fresh green beans. And so we don't think of them as having provenance, but of course they do, right? They come from somewhere. And they may or may not say on the package what state they came from. But it's very possible that they came from Oregon.